Welcome back, guys. This is part 2 of the engine modification and swap guide. We're going to give you a quick overview, the pros and cons of all the popular swaps that people perform on these Mark 1s, and give you my opinion, little advice, what is probably the best swap. There is no perfect answer. I shouldn't say that this is the perfect swap for everybody, but it kind of covers a little bit of everything that you want with a swap. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to talk about the giveaway we're doing. I wanted to point out that we're nearing 1,000 subscribers, which means we're getting ready to monetize. So even though by the time we do this giveaway and pick a winner, we probably won't be at that mark, I just felt like this gift card I'm giving away works really well with this topic we're discussing. So why the hell not? And what that is that we're giving away is a $100 gift card to S&P Auto. For those who are not familiar, S&P Auto is basically your one-stop shop for all things swap related. He sells other aftermarket performance parts. So definitely check them out. Browse all the different products they have. Not just Mark 1 stuff either. So check out the shop even if you own a Mark 2 or 3, 4. That being said, I just want to say this is not in any way, shape, or form endorsed or sponsored by anybody, especially not S&P. I just love promoting Alan and his company purely because of his products and the type of person that he is and how well he stands behind his product. There's even a company we're going to talk about that I am not a big fan of. For reasons we'll get into briefly. They provide a product that's reputable, that they stand behind, and at the end of the day, it would be a disservice not to inform you guys or mention that they're a reliable place to get these parts from. So we'll get into that briefly. In terms of how to enter this giveaway, leave a comment down below with what your particular favorite swap is for these cars. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. You can leave a one-word answer, but if you also want to give your opinion of which and why a certain swap is your favorite, please feel free. Let's have a good discussion down below, because at the end of the day, this is all just my opinion I'm voicing. In terms of when we're going to end and choose the winner, I guess we'll figure that out in a little bit. It took me a day to kind of figure out what kind of end date I wanted to do. Let's figure 2 weeks. Today's the 12th. Let's do Sunday the 26th, I guess. If I can't do it by then, maybe we'll do the 27th or the day before on the 25th. I don't know. We'll see. But figure we'll do about 2 weeks. So speaking of companies and swap parts, we've got S&P Auto, your one-stop shop. He offers kits, harness services, all sorts of other swap-related stuff. He also has some other non-swap related parts on there. And he also, like I said before, he has stuff for even up to Mark 5s and 6s, I believe. So check them out. You've got Dave Wright out of New York. He specializes in swap harnesses. Great guy. Everybody has nothing but good things to say about him. I've seen nothing but quality work come from his hands. Cannot recommend him enough for harness services. Then next up, we've got Eurowise, and this is the company I was talking about where I'm not a big fan of them, and the reason for that is because at times, more so a few years ago, this isn't so much recent anymore because people have voiced out about it, and there was some backlash and back and forth. At times there have been parts that have been sent with questionable welds and questionable structural integrity. It seemed for a short while there was, beginner level fabricators working on stuff while he was worrying about other more important things. And again, this is in his defense. They're working on exotic cars there. So Mark 1s, I don't blame him for not keeping his finger, putting his hands and eyes on every single part that goes out of there, Mark 1 related or not. But at the end of the day, Mike from Eurowise has always stepped up to the plate whenever there is a concern and made things right. It's a reputable product that he stands behind. But I don't want to scare you away from going to Eurowise. Many of you have seen me badmouth them on the pages, so I just wanted to clear that air. By no means were questionable products intentionally sent to people, so don't get that impression. But same thing as S&P and Dave Wright specializes in mount kits and wiring harness services. Now, last I checked, Eurowise and Dave Wright work together. Dave Wright provides the wiring harness services as well as some other things. At least last I checked, that was the case. If it's not anymore, sorry. So we've got S&P Auto. We've got Dave Wright. You can look him up on YouTube, TDC Shop. Look him up on Facebook as Dave Wright. And then Eurowise. Check out their website. I'll leave all these links in the description. Any which one of them can help get you going, and if they can't help you with something, they'll at least point you in the right direction. These swaps we're about to talk about, I will also make a disclaimer that I have not actually owned and regularly driven most of these. However, I have driven each and every one of these and owned pretty much all of these motors for extended periods of time. You know, I had a Mark IV 1.8T for 6 or 7 years, so I became very familiar with the reliability and tunability of that motor. I owned a VR6 for 3 years, so same thing. The only motor I haven't actually owned that we're going to talk about and driven on a daily basis is the TDI, though I do know plenty of people who have plenty of experience both with TDI cars and TDI swapped cars. So first up, we've got the 16 valve. It came as both a 1.8 and 2.0 liter. It came in Scirocco's and Mark II GLIs and GTIs. So it bolts right in, basically use the same mounts as your Mark I. The ignition and the fueling is a little different. You're gonna have to do a little bit of work to get that working on your Mark I, but it's not too intensive. This isn't a step-by-step how-to video on all these swaps, because then it would be 5 or 6 hours long. So we're not going to get into that. Use Google. If you manage to find and watch this video, you should be able to manage to you should be able to look up this part for yourself. But it's a fairly easy and straightforward swap. Now, the downside, I wouldn't really call it a downside, because it depends on what you want and expect out of the car. But one of the downsides is it's not a very low-end torquey motor. They really don't wake up until 3,000 or 4,000 RPMs, especially if you put cams in it. My Mark II GLI I had for a few years. It had the Euro exhaust cam, I believe, is the one cam that you could swap in. In Europe, one of the camshafts, it's the intake or the exhaust, is a better upgrade. So I had the Euro cam in there. The bigger Euro 50mm intake, and the previous owner knew how to tune the fueling properly, so it had some real nice power. Me and a buddy who has a 12 valve VR swapped Mark II GTI, we did a little highway pull, and I think we did like a 40 or 50 mile per hour roll. And he only put about 1.5 cars on me, which is pretty respectable for a 16 valve. You know, it goes to show that with a little bit of effort, your 16 valve can be as fast as a VR swap. Mine didn't start making power until 4,300 RPM. So it's a bit sluggish in the lower RPMs. That's just the nature of that motor. Still really, really fun, high revving motor. Pretty solid reputation for being reliable too. Really, we should have dove into this motor first. But whatever. The Mark II 1.6 turbo diesel is a bit better than anything you'd find in a Mark I. It's a real straightforward swap since it's all mechanical diesel. The injection pump is mechanical. There's no computers or wiring to deal with. So it's an option. You're not really going to find these motors too easily though, so it's not really even worth bringing up to discuss, but it is an option, so we're going to talk about it anyways. So if you come across a cheap donor, it's not a bad option. While we're on the topic of diesels, with the Mark IIIs, we were introduced to a 1.9 turbo diesel, which again, the early ones are mechanical, so you don't have to deal with computers and wiring again. That's a great swap, but the downside is you're not going to find one very easily, and if you do find one, it's going to be priced higher than giraffe pussy. These cars rotted out pretty easily, and a lot of them ended up in the junkyard. So you just don't find that motor easily, and when you do, you're going to pay for it. As the Mark IIIs got newer, we eventually got the TDI. Again, it's a 1.9 turbo diesel, but you're no longer dealing with a mechanical diesel, so you do have a computer and wiring to deal with. However, it is fairly simple. Even though the work required to get the computer and wiring in isn't too bad, it just adds more. It just adds more to deal with, naturally driving the cost up. This is when you'll start dealing with the downsides of the turbo diesel swaps. Again, the major downside is cost. Not to say that throwing a tune on one of these computerized turbo diesels is all that complicated. It's just a cost factor at that point. You're no longer turning a few bolts on your injection pump and slapping a bigger turbo on it to get more power. That's really the main downside of the turbo diesels. The other downside is you're dealing with the turbo. You're prone to turbo failures. Again, it's an added cost. If you get an old turbo that's in questionable health, you're now paying to rebuild or replace that turbo. I've said it before and I'll say it again though, these newer TDI motors are probably the best power delivery you can find on these Mark 1s. It's instant torque, some really crazy fuel consumption, people are getting up over 50 miles to the gallon. It's plenty of power for your day-to-day driving, and making you giggle like a little kid. I say it all the time, this is my particular favorite swap. It's the only thing that's kept me from actually doing and owning one, just the cost associated to it. I've now gotten to drive 3 different TDI swapped Mark 1s, and they're just a blast. It doesn't get any better than that. Now, as much as I love the TDI, I am not going to give it the title of the best swap. That would have to go to the ABA. Just don't fight it. ABA swap the world, people. Let it happen. Your friends are doing it. All the cool kids are doing it. You should be doing it too. It's cheap. They're all over the place. They're easy to find. They're very tunable. And even just throwing one in stock requires very minimal work. This motor is, as some of you know, is the 2-liter. It was offered in Mark 3s. So you can find them everywhere. They're dirt cheap in some cases. Some people can't give them away. You could get yourself an entire Mark III donor car for $500. So the availability is through the roof, thus making the cost nice and low. The reliability is through the roof. The ease of getting parts. You could walk into any AutoZone and pretty much get anything you need next day for them. But you really don't need much to keep them running. I could go on for days telling you stories about the abuse that I've put several ABAs through. You just can't kill them. If you manage to kill an ABA, you were trying to, or you're a moron. You might ask yourself, is there a downside to the ABA? Of course. Stock, the power isn't through the roof. It's nice, but it's nothing crazy. Stock, they're rated at 115 or so to the crank. Even if you go throwing a camshaft and building up the head, you're not making a ton of power. However, if you slap a turbo on this sucker, you're in business. You can throw 5 or 10 pounds of boost through it and it's going to handle it all day long, no problem. You can make a very easy and reliable 150 horsepower to the wheels just by slapping a turbo on it and getting a few pounds of boost through it. It kind of checks all the boxes. If you're just looking for a nice, reliable, modern swap with some decent power gains, a stock one is gonna hit that mark for you. If you're wanting a bit more power out of it, you can easily hit 200 horsepower to the wheels with one, but it's a very stout, capable motor. Definitely my number one choice and recommendation for Mark 1 swaps. In terms of the work involved to swap one in, they bolt right in. The only thing that doesn't match right up is, again, the fueling and the wiring for the added ECU. You're going to have to get, if you're not going to do the wiring yourself, which is fairly straightforward and easy to do, but still no shame in commissioning that out to one of the guys we just spoke about to make you up a harness. So all said and done, you should very easily be able to get an ABA swapped into your Mark 1 for under $1,000, well under $1,000, thus making it one of the most cost effective. Pretty much anything you're trying to do, it's going to do it. I think really the only legitimate complaint about it doesn't sound good. 4 cylinders just don't sound good. It's not that visually pleasing. If you're into like those show builds, but I mean, let's be honest, this channel isn't really about show cars. Availability, cost, reliability, tunability. It has it all. Next up, we've got the 1.8T and the VR6s. I guess we'll go into VR6s next because of how much I hate them. I'm going to give you an unbiased opinion on them. Start off by just telling you why I don't like them. They're heavy, they are bulky, and they just don't make that much power for the amount of money you're going to invest in one. You know, all said and done, you're up past that $1,000 mark. Unless you're crafty, you could find cheap deals. You can do a lot of the work yourself. The swap kits, the same thing. You're talking $700, $800, $900. You got to deal with your wiring and ECU and all that. And then you're only making 150 or 60 horsepower. But like, these are the major downsides. You're limited with power unless you boost them. So at the same time, they're terrible and awesome motors. Because without boosting them, you're limited on power. You're spending a lot of money to get them in there. You have a physically massive motor that you're now stuffing into that engine bay, and furthermore, when it comes to working on it, you're very tight on space. It's a massive motor for these small bays. It fits. So on that note, S&P and Eurowise both sell cooling components, and this is very important because once you start talking these bigger, newer motors, you start running out of space. And a problem with the Mark 1s is that radiator, the stock radiator, is too tall to tuck into that radiator support. So there's a bunch of valuable room down underneath that rad support on these cars. And like I said, both Eurowise and S&P offer solutions to take advantage of this space to make these swaps more manageable. The 1.8T you could get away without altering your cooling system much. I have seen people use the stock radiator, though it's still strongly recommended that you go with one of these options, even with one of the 1.8Ts, because of the cooling efficiency. You know, you get more power, you get more heat, you're going to want more cooling. So when you're talking VR and 1.8T swaps, you're going to want a better, smaller radiator. Eurowise and S&P have you covered with this. I don't know too much about what Eurowise offers, so check their website, see if they offer the same thing. But S&P offers radiator intercooler combination kits. I would say if you're dealing with the 12 valve, really consider horsepower you're getting out of them for the money you're spending. Just like I couldn't stress it enough in the last video, spend your money wisely. Once you start talking about the 24 valve and the 3.2 liter VRs, those are making some much more respectable power, naturally aspirated. In terms of reliability, they have an overall great reputation. When things do start to go wrong with them, they can be very expensive, primarily with the timing chains. It's not an easy nor cheap job to do. Most people address the timing chains proactively when they have the motor out of the car before they actually swap it in. Take that into consideration. Now, there's more that I don't like about these motors than I do, so naturally we're going to go back and forth between pros and cons. Back to the weight aspect. There's a lot of controversy over the added weight. Some people exaggerate it, some people downplay it. When in reality, on paper, it's not a huge weight difference, but it's enough to matter. And what people don't always take into consideration is it's more so the placement of the weight than it is the weight itself. It's only like 50, 75 pound difference, so it's really not a whole lot of weight in and of itself. These VRs tend to tilt much further forward and closer to the front rad support once bolted in. So even though it might only be 50, 75 pound difference, it will almost act like you're adding twice that. I'm not saying it's exactly like adding double the weight, but you know, you have to really take into consideration you're putting that weight further forward in front of the wheels, and it's going to alter the handling of the car. You could take measures to help remedy this, you know, specifically with your coilovers and other suspension components, and there are ways to get that motor to sit a bit further back, but ultimately you're making an already front heavy car even more front heavy. You're still throwing a boat anchor up in the front of these tin cans, so it's not going to handle as well no matter what you do. You get it to handle well, but it's not going to handle as well as a 4-cylinder. There's a lot of people that argue, oh, it handles just as well on the road course. Okay, but you know, most of us aren't taking these cars to the road course. So I'm sure in some scenarios Yes, it handles as well or better. It's all subjective to many variables. Now getting back to the physical size, the oil pan sits way lower than the rest of the car. Once you VR swap a Mark 1, that is now the lowest point of the car. There are remedies to this issue, one of which is physically raising the motor higher, but there's only so high you could go before you hit the hood of the car. You can also put in a Mark 5 oil pan and oil pump. You gain, I don't think it's a whole lot for the amount of money you spend, but when you're dealing with this kind of issue, every little bit adds up. So if you're going to do a VR swap, look into the Mark 5 R32 oil pan and pump because it will help raise that oil pan up. And if you're somewhere with nice roads, this obviously isn't as much of a concern, but here in the Northeast and other parts of the country where the roads are known to be absolute garbage, it's a very valid concern, especially if you're lowered. Even at stock height, that oil pan sits very low. Going back to some positives of this motor, great torque, great low end power. The VR is also the best option if you're going for big power. In terms of just slapping a turbo on it, the VR is going to get you the best results. If you're going to go building the motor, throwing better internals in it, the 1.8T might be the better option, but you're going to hit your limits on the 1.8T in terms of stock internals before you hit limits of the VR stock internals. That 1.8T is only good for about 350 horsepower before you start breaking rods. The VR, I believe, has the same weak point being the rods, but you can get more power out of them before they fail. And let's be honest, it's arguably one of the best sounding motors that Volkswagen has ever produced. So gotta give it credit where it's due. We'll give the VR title of best all-around power and sound. Lastly, we've got the 1.8T, the 20 valve 1.8 liter turbo that came in the Mark IVs. Great little motor. Bit harder to find a donor car for because there are certain engine codes that are better than others. I think it's pretty safe to say that the best 1.8T to look into when it comes to Mark 1 swaps is the Aiibi engine code. I forget the exact years, but I know for sure it comes in like the early Passats, so like the 99 Passats. Main reasons why this is the best 1.8T to look into, the engine mounts. One of the mounts you need to get a mount for, but otherwise the other three bolt right up. It goes right in. In terms of computer, they don't have an immobilizer. These newer Volkswagens, they have what's called an immobilizer, which is a security feature. In short, just makes things more complicated. These Aiibi motors and ECUs that came with them are the simplest and most straightforward to swap in. The only downside is that you're dealing with a KO3 turbo. And to sum this up very short, the early 1.8Ts only came with what was called the KO3 turbo, and they were only rated at about 150 horsepower at the crank. 2002, end of 2001 came the KO3S, and then you're talking 180 horsepower at the crank. But you can easily swap to one of these newer KO3S turbos and be right at that 180 horsepower mark. And that's the turbo you're going to want, especially if you're going to do one of these chip tunes. By the time the Mark IVs came around, these simple flash tunes were all the rage. $500 got you another 50-60 horsepower. You get an Aiibi with a KO3S, $500 tune from APR. If the ECU doesn't already have one, or you don't already come across an ECU with one, they're all over the place, so it should be pretty easy to find an ECU with a tune on it already, with a KO3S tune on it already. But worst case scenario, $500 tune, and you're making like 210 to the wheels. My Mark IV, I had just a tune and a downpipe, and I made 215 horsepower and like 209 torque. Overall, they're a very reliable motor. The fuel consumption is pretty good, especially when you put it in a lighter car like that. And it's really easy to get parts for, given how new of a motor it is and the sheer number of cars that they made that have this motor. The downsides of the 1.8T really just boils down to the cost and I guess availability if you're really shooting for that Aiibi motor code. Otherwise, you could use pretty much any other 1.8T. You do need to deal with more engine mounts at that point and other ECU solutions, more computer solutions. But more or less, the biggest downside to the 1.8T is the cost. You're going to do some legwork looking for the right donor car. This also applies to the VR. Depending on the age and condition and mileage of whatever motor you find, you're going to have to put some maintenance into it, just whether it be some seals or actual hard parts. I wouldn't say go doing a full rebuild of each motor, but you're going to want to look at it. You're going to want to stop and take a look and figure out what maintenance work you want to do to this motor before you put it in.